Our speaker tonight is Frank Uri, and he is a longtime Orange County resident, member of the Technology Advisory Council for the Orange County Sheriff's Department, senior client executive of Computer Aid, an advisor on cybersecurity policies for the local government, and served as mayor of the City of Mission Viejo, 2004 to 2016. So, without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and pass things on over to Frank. Welcome.
Thank you all very much. I will now do the share screen and make sure that this is all working. Does that look all right there? Is that working?
Yeah, I can see your screen now. It's
okay, great.
Still in.
You look all right, Michael?
Yes, looks
okay,
good.
Super. Well, first off, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here today. It's very strange doing a presentation like this and not having people in front of you to take a look at and everything. So we'll see if we can get through it. As Michael mentioned, Frank Uri, not only electrical engineering background, but also getting on the political side. So this dovetails pretty nicely with the entire topic. What we're going to do today is pretty much go over the California Consumer Privacy Act that was passed a couple of years ago by the state of California. Not really in a position to make all of you practitioners, but certainly give you the overview necessary to turn yourself into dangerous people as far as privacy within the state of California. So we'll jump into it. So today we'll go a little bit over the background. I think it's kind of important to get a little context in terms of what people are looking for, what the goals are of it, and there are actually some wide-ranging implications that I'll go over. We'll hit some of the highlights of the act itself and what we're going through, and then we're going to go through the different provisions within the CCPA. Basically, who does it cover? Definitions, which are extremely important, and quite candidly, the definitions are evolving, and I think we're going to see that out of the legislation and out of the act itself. I always say it's kind of interesting. We've got a lot of technical people on the call. It's always very humorous to watch non-technical people write technical legislation, and sometimes there might be a little bit of a loss in translation between what some of the leaders want versus what they can have. So we'll go through some of that and then get into the key parts of it, which are the consumer rights and the things that have been put onto individuals. Of course, we'll have to talk about the downside with penalties, and all through the conversation, we'll go over some of the compliance aspects that are needed to make sure things are put in place for the CCPA.
Frank, this is Dan. You're sharing your presentation, and we're seeing the presentation mode screens. Could you maybe stop sharing and then reshare and choose the screen that shows just the presentation, not the presentation mode?
Let's see, screen. Go that one. That work better?
Let's see. Perfect. Thank you.
That better? Okay. It's funny because I can't see that on my screen, so totally got you on that one. So first off, has been advised to me by many of my friends, this is a disclaimer. This is not legal advice in any way, shape, or form. It's an overview of it. As the saying goes, see dealer for details. Your mileage may vary. Talk to key people if there's some things you need to know on from a legal standpoint. So there's the disclaimer, and I'm completely done with that one. Let's see. The next one. Oh, there we go. So a little bit of the background of it. So in California, interestingly, we actually do have a constitutional right to privacy. The Constitution was amended back in 1972 that specifically codified the fact that we have an inalienable right to privacy. Obviously, there are a lot of implications across the spectrum, but it was one of the linchpins by which they decided to put together what was known as AB 375. And 375 was the legislative number that put this in place. And just to give you a little quick story, I had a conversation about 5 or 6 years ago with the district attorney in Northern California. And I want to preface that because we're in South County here and everybody knows everybody. I don't want anybody to think this is the Orange County district attorney. But as I was talking to the individual, we were talking about body cameras and how body cameras can be used to help with certain law enforcement components. And one of the things this individual mentioned was the era of privacy is over. And I thought it was pretty profound when she said that, because what the point that was being made was, with everything being so incredibly public, You've got body cameras, you've got cameras going on outside, you've got people on the internet conversing with folks. It was just an interesting point that was being made, was that the expectation, even though we have the right to privacy, the expectation of it sometimes may exceed what we can do from a practical standpoint. So I thought that was a very interesting point that this individual made, and kind of dovetails a little bit into what the legislature was trying to do, which is trying to rein back some of that privacy that they have put in place. So as I mentioned, AB 375 enacted back in 2018, and they did that because they wanted to give enough runway for the legislature, for the attorney general to put everything in place that they needed to enact the Privacy Act that they put in place. And it's really at the high level, it's to grant consumers a right to request a business to disclose how they're going about getting specific pieces of personally identifiable information in many, many different forms, and how they can take that information and actually sell it if they do sell it, and disclosing that information back to the individuals. And especially with everything that you're hearing right now with just the pushback from all the social media sites and all the data that's being harvested and collected, I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of consumers really don't know what they have the rights to enact and what they don't. And that's part of what what the act itself is looking to try to convey in legislation. So one of the things that means from the state of California standpoint is it has some pretty profound implications. And we've seen this time and time again, as goes California, so often goes the rest of the nation. Since this act has been put in place, there are several other states that have actually introduced legislation. I don't know if any of them have passed it, I'm sure they have. But the general consensus is within the next 5 years, each state will have their own version of the Privacy Act, with the goal of, I think, eventually getting into some sort of federal legislation where they will put in place federally the protections that everybody has. Once again, you can kind of get an idea of the companies that are pushing for this and the companies that are resisting against it to try to make it as least restrictive as possible. So it does have national implications. Another implication for at least the state of California, it does have strong enforcement, a strong enforcement component. Unlike so much the GDPR, individuals within the state of California can bring about private action themselves. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but you don't necessarily need to wait for either the district attorney or the attorney general to bring an action should one be warranted. There's a lot of individual rights and individuals that can bring forward different components of the act and push it in that direction. And also, we will be talking, because one of the things I think that's very important about the act is the ability to cure. If an individual company is aware of some violations, there are statutory protections so that they can cure anything that goes on, and we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. So what are some of the risks for those not in compliance? Because that's kind of the big question. It really breaks down into 3 or 4 different main ones. Of course, there's financial, how things are going to be processed from a financial standpoint. And because of the violations that are in place and it's per incident, even though the individual fines may not be that high, if you're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of records or individuals, it can escalate rather quickly. And I think that's one of the reasons why they've given a large berth in terms of given the ability to cure, because they need to make sure that both sides are equally protected. There's of course the reputation damage, and I think especially in days with the social media and the communications that we have, branding, imaging can go down very quickly. And I think I always remember back to the Tylenol poisoning issue that happened in the 80s. I think that's a textbook case of a company taking a very bad situation, turning it around, remediating and getting back into play versus other companies that may have gone under. I think there will be a lot of opportunities for individual companies to take a look at, if they're not in compliance, and how that's going to actually affect their overall reputation and need to be working on. And of course, the impact on employees. I know that some Boeing employees and others, given the issues that they've had with just the planes, I think there's a corollary there to what might be going on as far as non-compliance, especially in the area of personal privacy and security. There's a lot to be lost if individual companies don't take that into effect. And then, of course, there's the cost of non-compliance from a regulatory standpoint. A lot of that has to do with implications regarding will new legislation be enacted if somebody's a bad actor and isn't playing nice in the sandbox? Will they then get additional regulations foisted upon them by either state or local government? So now Daniel, we're at the first question. If you want to, do I need to hand control back, or are you good to go on the first question? We got a little survey question we're teeing up here. Anybody see that? So the question is, prior to tonight, how often have you read with any focus any of the privacy disclosures sent to you by companies who send you that privacy information? So I think it'll be an interesting cross section, because so much of that turns into stuff that we toss in the bin. Daniel, can you tell me when we can move on? All right, so come on. Okay, so infrequently, that's about 71% infrequently, never 12%. Unfortunately, I think after you look at the first one, I kind of fall into that category. And then all the time, interesting, the people that read the Apple disclosures when they come through. Okay, thanks. So this is just a high level. I threw this together because I think at a broad stroke, it gives you the high level views of things. The key components of CCPA are really threefold. The first one is transparency, making sure that individuals know what is being done with their data. And that ties directly into disclosure, making sure that the individual companies have a mechanism by which to let individuals know. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll be discussing what are the actions and the rights that individuals can execute to exact their own rights to what they're working on through CCPA. If you have these three things in mind, it kind of gives you a general idea of exactly where CCPA is going with them. So what is the CCPA at the highest level? Essentially what they're doing is it's the public conveyance of rights upon individuals regarding the data that their personal data and how their personal data is being used. And it really falls into four buckets. We'll be going into these in a bit more detail a little bit later, but essentially it's the right to know about the personal information and how it's being used by businesses. It's the right to basically what's called opt out, or the right to disappear, where you have the right to delete your information, have that information deleted, and then not have to go back to them over and over again to exact that right. So that's to delete. You also have the right to opt out, and we'll get into some details as far as when those decisions are made. But you have the right to opt out of how that information and whether or not that information is collected at all. There may be repercussions on that. You may not be able to participate in certain interactions based on that, but by and large, the right to opt out and say you don't want to participate is there. And then finally, the right to non-discrimination, the right to not be treated disparagingly because you make certain choices. And that's actually, if you read the legislation, it's actually a big component of it. They wanted to make sure that individuals recognizing their own privacy rights would not be viewed differently than other normal entities within the CCP and within the state of California. As I mentioned before, it was effective January 1st. One of the things that actually put that out a little bit, according to the statute, the Attorney General had to write some basic clarifying regulations that they put together. And that was actually just delivered to the world on the 26th of June. Interesting in there, it's 29 pages long. It's a lot of very light reading, but it puts in force the enforcement mechanisms and codifies a lot of the therefores and what shalls, so that individuals have a bit more clarity as far as how it's to be enacted. What makes it challenging there, and I do appreciate talking today, but basically the Attorney General's notes have only been out for a couple of weeks. So there's still a lot of review and interpretations going on that. But I think there's going to be quite a bit of discussion over the next several months. And just to be very candid, I also think that means that there's going to be a fair amount of cleanup legislation that goes forward. There are a lot of aspects I think that weren't thought of, maybe weren't quite thought through of, especially in the area of, I think there needs to expand some things regarding video storage and retention, and who owns it. But that'll be coming up as we go forward with this. So, which companies and who does the CCPA impact? And I want to point out before we started, I'll go down to the note. These conditions are an or condition; they're not an and. If you satisfy any one of these conditions, then you are needed to be in compliance and run with it. And to be clear, also, this impacts California-based companies, and what I mean by a California resident. So if you have a company that's based in Alabama, but you transact in California, or you have a customer in California, and you meet any of those criteria, you would be impacted. So basically, anybody with any substantial presence is included. You need to have a gross annual income. If you have something over 25 million, you're there. If you were a small shop doing business in California, you've got 2 or 3 consultants, you do 9 million a year and cover nothing else, then you're not needed to be compliant. If you're over 25 million, you are. If you buy, sell, or receive any of the personal information of 50,000 or more California residents, then that affects you. What's interesting there is that actually it's pretty simple to get up to that 50,000 mark, especially if you have an online presence where you're interacting with people, or you have a website that gets a certain number of visitors per day. You can easily hit that number. Or if you derive 50% of your business from selling or transacting the personal data from California residents. Any of those 3 conditions are basically would make your company or your venture have to play in the CCPA sandbox. What I think is also interesting, this is kind of a little bit of a going off the discussion topics. Right now, it doesn't impact local government. And a lot of the areas of interest that I work on are government and government-based. It doesn't touch government yet. My guess is government agencies or nonprofits. My guess is probably within the next 5 years, they will be writing some level of legislation to try to not necessarily clean up, but try to bring those entities into the realm of being under compliance. Because, and I mention this to a lot of times when I speak, I could easily see instances where local government would have a lot of information. Pick one, AYSO. You got the names of all these 12-year-old kids who are growing, and you can harvest that information and maybe get some discounts from Nike if you transact that list to Nike and do some other things. So just general ideas. I think there's a lot of areas we can take a look at in the area of government, and government does store an enormous amount of data. And as I mentioned, this is an or condition, so hit any of those 3 and you're all, basically you're in play. So I'm not going to read all this, don't worry, we're not going to go through the eye chart, but a couple of key definitions that are really important. The consumer is very definitively defined. A person who's a California resident as of the different dates. It's important to realize that it does affect the California consumer. If you're transacting with somebody in Nevada or something, it doesn't. It'll be interesting once this starts going nationwide, how the different states will interact with each other regarding tightening this up. Then we get into the section of personal information, and this is actually an interesting area for me because I think they've gone as far in one direction as they possibly could to encompass just about everything. Some of the PII is pretty easy to imagine: social security number, bank account names, email addresses, and things like that. There also are, any type of information gleaned on the internet, your internet browsing history, search history, how you interact with consumers and things like that. Then we get down to stuff that's a bit more definitive and discrete. Geolocation data is included, biometric data. If you've got one of those watches that has your pulse and everything like that, data collected through that is counted. Then, any audio electronic information. The interesting definition I find on this one is the fact that they're interested in some sort of personally identifiable olfactory information. I don't know if that means you go online and either you smell bad or you can smell certain things, but apparently olfactory is in there as part of one of them, or similar types of information. Obviously, employment information, HIPAA-based information regarding medical, all that is not counted in addition to your education information. Your GMAT, your GRE, or your calculus scores are not supposed to be public. Now, there is a key exclusion to all this. If there is some personally identifiable information that you've put out there on the web and can be gleaned from another source, you may not have the protections of the CCPA. And basically what they're saying is that information can be gleaned through outside sources. Guess what, King's X, that's not going to count. So if you can, and a lot of notable areas on that, a lot of property tax information, your address and things like that can be part of what is publicly available, would not necessarily be covered by that. So this is where we're going to get into the meat of the discussion, because this is the key component. It's, you know, the rights that are currently defined for consumers. And once again, I will not be reading all through these, but I'll just give you the kind of high level flavor. The first one is to right to know about the personal information and how it's being used. And I pulled some things in here just for reference in case it might be helpful, including the citation section. But the consumer has the right to know and the right to request from the business that collects consumer data, the right to know what the information is collected and how it's being used. Very highly, you know, makes complete sense. The categories that have been defined by the Attorney General's regulation, I actually just pulled this in this week. Specific pieces of information that they have about the consumer. It could be, you know, figure you go and order something online, they might know your shoe size or what types of books you like, things along those lines. Anything that's not out there in the public is private. Categories of PII that have been collected about the consumer. These are the things that need to be provided to the consumer should they make the request. Where the sources that they come from, and any of the categories of information of the business that is sold or disclosed. All that information, the consumer has the right to make a request of the company that's doing that, and has a right to get that information, get those questions answered. And business or commercial purposes for who the information is being collected to. And this is where it's going to get down. We'll talk about it in a little bit. The tracking of how data is managed within your company is really at the forefront of all this. If it's kind of loosey-goosey and you're not sure which divisions or which departments, which databases have certain information, to comply with CCPA, that's going to need to be, you know, taken under advisement. It's going to need to be an area that is worked on. So that's the right to know about personal information. So you have the right to know what they're collecting and why. You also have the right to have that information deleted. So once that information is disclosed to a consumer, they may request that the personal information that is collected and collected by the business, the right to have that information deleted. The businesses must disclose the consumer's right to request the deletion, and the business that receives a verifiable request, and I'll talk about verifiable requests a little bit later because that's actually extremely important. But once the request is made, there are certain statutory timings where the company has to delete that information. Now, one of the interesting areas, an area that comes up quite a bit, is what about backups and archives? So you keep information and you do daily or weekly or monthly backups. You know, to what extent do you have to go back in history to make sure that that information complies with the CCPA? The general rules that are being defined, especially by the Attorney General, is that if you have current information that's being processed by your company in a current data archive, that's the information that needs to be kept in, that's the data that needs to definitely be deleted once the request is made. However, you don't need to go back and pull out backups of your files, and you don't have to pull out the backups and delete all of your backups and your restoration files. You don't have to do that unless you restore from those files. So part of the requirements that are listed in the Attorney General's information is that you need to keep track of the deletion requests that are made, and should you recover or restore information from a backup, you need to exact those same rules on the data that you pull forward. So let's say your system's crashing, you need to rebuild your ERP or a CRM system. You need to bring with that, by bringing that back, you also need to bring the rules and all the requests that have been made by individuals in the past, so that you can comply with their requests. So the key message here is you don't have to do anything in your archives unless you restore. And if you restore, you need to do the same rules against them. So you also have the right to opt out. So once the individuals get the information that they're looking for, they have the right to ask that they opt out of this level of interaction, that information can come out and that information is no longer put forward. Now, it's very important also that the notice of the right to opt out has to be presented in such a way that it's very easy to understand for the regular consumer. So, and there are actually provisions within it, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, some very declarative language, but it has to use plain, straightforward language that any person can understand. And you also have to put it in such a format that it easily draws the consumer's attention to the notice so they understand their rights. and it's kind of funny, I got a disclaimer or a privacy notice from a firm, whoever my life insurance policy is. And it's interesting to note how long their privacy disclosures are getting. And I don't think it's necessarily because they want to obfuscate things. I think it has a lot more to do with the fact that they're interested in making sure that all of their bases are covered. But it needs to be easy, declarative to follow. And now here's the kicker, we kind of get into almost like election law. It has to be available in languages in which the business normally does business. So if you take a look at it, for instance, in the county of Orange, I think we have 47 or so languages that we put into play for our for voting and stuff like that. Well, if you do business in a whole bunch of different languages, you need to make sure that you're putting that information out there in languages that will assist. And then, okay, so as what I mentioned before, the notice for the right to opt out. And we'll be talking a little bit about more noticing in a little bit, but the business that does that, that has that information, needs to give that notice, and it needs to be very easy to read. And the definitive language that's put into the Attorney General's opinion and the legislation is that you need to post it with the lines, either do not sell my personal information or do not sell my info. And that link has to be on the website, so that, or any type of page that they go to, so they understand exactly what their privacy rights are. And they do understand up front, without having to root around for it, that they do have the right to opt out of that information. So as I mentioned, and this is, I'm just kind of putting this up there as an example, but this is one of the disclosures that I just got, and this was the latest update to my life insurance. I'm not giving you any PII unless you can read the QR code. But basically what this is just kind of showing you an example. And it starts off, important privacy information you have, call us at 1-800. You see that they've really gone through the process of making sure that you know exactly how to communicate with them as they go forward. So I've got a few more examples here, but I thought it'd be interesting to just pop one in there and show everybody them. So along with this, which is actually an interesting inflection point, they actually have to give you the right to opt back in, which is an interesting thing. So you're having your data collected, you decided that you don't want to do it, you opt out. The consumers actually, in the statute, have the right to change their minds. And now, I haven't read anything yet that says, can you change your mind Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then go back Tuesday, Thursday? I haven't gotten that far in it, but the consumers have the right to change their mind, and the individual companies need to offer the mechanisms and the processes to opt back in. And actually, I'll be talking about overall policies in a little bit, but this should be a component of your policies that you put in place, how to opt back in and get back into the fray. Another very important one, and as I mentioned earlier, the legislation spent a lot of time wanting to make sure that individuals who presented or decided to enact their privacy rights, they wanted to make sure that there was not an opportunity for these companies to discriminate. And it's these are just a few of the areas that they go into, but I think this is one of the bigger areas where I think there could be a lot of liabilities for individual companies. If they don't play nice in the sandbox on the non-discrimination side, they could be in quite a bit of trouble. I think it's imperative that everybody kind of err on the side of caution. So a couple of the areas where individuals could be treated unfairly would be, of course, denying goods and services, different price rates, unless, and there are other things detailed in the legislation that allows them to collect some money from it, based on what's going on. But in general, different prices shouldn't be one of them. Quality of service is definitely another one if they're exercising that right, and making sure you don't treat people meanly. And also kind of giving the suggestion that the consumer will get different prices based on their actions. There really needs to be a blind opt-in, a blind opt-out, and no repercussions coming from any of that. So part of what I think is important from a compliance standpoint in non-discrimination, and as you can get the idea, this is really going to require, if you haven't done so already, it's really going to require a relook at all the policies you have in place. But basically, need to make sure that codified within your policies, after you do some review, is making sure that the policies and procedures are tight in terms of not treating individuals differently based on their decision and their rights under CCPA. It's also important, and you'll find this all over the place, that noticing individuals to make sure that they have the opportunity to receive incentives and other compensation should they decide to opt in. That's another component with it. And and we'll talk a little bit about the consent side, but businesses may obtain consumer opt-in consent prior to enrolling in some sort of financial incentive program where there might be some tertiary benefit that everybody can agree to, but it doesn't treat everybody in a different manner. So I think we're at question number 2. Daniel, can you pop up question 2, please? Take a little break. How long do you think it's going to take the rest of the free world in the U.S. to substantially implement CCP in the jurisdictions in their area? And of course, because we're getting so much done in Washington, D.C. now, who knows how long it'll take for them to get to it, but they'll be putting something in place eventually. Some of the answers: 2 years, 5 years, and 7. Interesting. I think that, and just, now I put my own personal bias in. I think 2 years is definitely optimistic. It's quite a bit of area. 5 years might be there. I could easily see it be more than 7 years. I think it just could take quite a bit of time, but I think that the 5 years is definitely within the realm of what can be done. Oh, I didn't see it at the bottom. 7 years or more. Yeah, it could take a while. So interesting. So one of the big components within the CCPA is notice, making sure that people have a strong understanding of what their rights are, and it's got to be very, very easy to follow. So you kind of get in there that the consumer has a right in the business to get that information disclosed. This is the key component of the methods of notice on disclosure. The business that gets the personal information shall, at or before the point of collection. So you need to let them know ahead of time. It's not as though you can go start collecting all the data and then in 2 months say, oh, retroactively, let's go back and check with everybody. The legislation, the Attorney General's advice is, or actually their direction is very, very clear. It's got to be at or before the point of collection of the information. That the consumers need to be advised of what their rights are and what information is being collected. And if they decide they want to click and get additional information on it, they need to have that done specifically at that point. So we kind of go back real quickly to my life insurance policy. This is the, as I said, I received the other day 2 sheets of paper. One sheet was completely full of the privacy notice. That's all that it was. And of course, it gives them the first paragraph is the we're on your side, and then they start going into what all the different rights are. So making sure that's done at the point of collection. I actually think that now that I think about it, life insurance policies renew each year. Mine just renewed, and contemporaneous with that, I get this notice. So I have a feeling every time it renews with my new rates, this type of stuff will be coming in. But so, as I mentioned with the website notice, there's actually some things in the legislation that are pretty important, and they have some very declarative answers or information and regulation on the noticing and how long you have to hold information for. So organizations, as I mentioned, they have to put this information on their website, and they have to update that website at least once every 12 months to make sure they're in compliance, or at least show the paperwork that they got together and said that, yeah, we've done a good job about updating our online privacy. In that disclosure, there are several components that need to be listed. The first one, you need to have a description of their rights and very plain language on how to submit requests for that information. All the different categories of PII that are collected for the past 12 months also have to be available for the individuals and listed there. They also need to be able to have access to the categories of information that's sold that, and it needs to be stated there. And also have a list of the categories of personal information disclosed about the consumers for business purposes and for other types of consumer services. So basically, you get to have a 12-month look back as far as information and what might be sold. Now, this is also the important component. Requests that come in as far as either the requests for information about what's being collected, information queries from individuals, their request to opt out, their request for more information, that actually needs to be archived by the agency, by the companies for 24 months. So it gives everybody, it's almost like you have to hold on to your taxes for 7 years and all your information, your W-2s. For the requests that come in, you need to have a repeatable process and policies and probably its own database where you're tracking all these requests for all the individuals for at least 24 months with a 24-month look back. So as I mentioned, the key parts here, making sure that you create and follow your own policies. If you put the time, it's one of those things where it's almost like painting a house. All the work is in the prep. Once you get done putting the paint on, it's not very difficult. So make sure you spend the time to put the policies together, and that way it gives you the best opportunity to be in compliance. So I just decided to have a little fun today, but I went on the Aetna website and said, what type of disclosures do you need for Aetna? The Aetna disclosures were over 12 pages long. I just pulled a few things out of it just to have a little bit of fun. So you get on here, it says the uses and disclosures of personal information in the upper left. If there's any payment that's received, they describe that. Your legal rights, which I think is actually probably the most important component, but they outline all of your rights under CCPA and what you need to go through. And this is actually not CCPA specific, but obviously because they do business here, CCPA would be a subset at least of what they're doing. And then of course down in the lower right, it just gives a listing of all the different ways that you can go through to get questions answered on your personal right, on your privacy rights, and everything in there, including hearing impaired numbers and everything. And there's actually some language in there that individuals with disabilities need to also have access to this, be it visually impaired, hearing impaired, or whatever. I think we touched about this a little bit, but from just one repository, you need to have at least two methods available for consumers to request an understanding of their rights, either to exercise their rights or to get additional information. And one of the things that's very strongly put in there is that you really need to have a toll-free number. You just plan on having it. It actually seems to be almost more important than a website, but toll-free number definitely for one. Website information is kind of like the second one. I think most individual companies will do those too, but other forms are acceptable also. They can get stuff in writing, and things of that nature. So a couple things on the procedural side. If disclosure requests are made, agencies or companies, I always call it agencies, companies have 45 days to disclose the request. So if somebody comes in and says, I would like to know where all my data went, you have 45 days to enact that and to satisfy the legislation. There are provisions in there for extensions and for additional analysis. You can take a look at the legislation to find out the details. But the 45 days is how much time the individual company has. Another key point, and that's one of the reasons why I highlighted it here, the requests themselves that come in need to be verifiable. The legislation and the Attorney General's language went into a lot of depth regarding making sure that the content, that the requests themselves are verifiable. So whatever methodologies you have to verify the authenticity of individuals, you better follow them, because there's a lot of language in there saying you better not mess up. If I determine that I want to have all my data, or I go out and I decide I want to be Michael, and I'm like, please wipe out all my data and give me these rights for my PII, and I'm not Michael, they will get very angry with that. So make sure that you have a verifiable consumer request. If you use whatever you do, MFA or whatever it might be that you do for normally transacting with an individual, make sure it's a verifiable request, because if you go off that reservation, you will be frowned upon very strongly. So once again, making sure if you've got those policies and procedures in place already, you should be in pretty good shape. Penalties, just at a very high level. The AG is the primary vehicle that can do the enforcement. Intentional violations, and the way it defines the intentional violations is if you're doing either up to shenanigans in a way that you shouldn't be, or if you've been given a notice to cure and you haven't, the violations could be up to $7,500 per violation. If it's unintentional and you haven't been able to cure it very quickly, then it could be up to $2,500 per violation. And as I mentioned, because it's based on per record, obviously these numbers can go up quite a bit. So that's the Attorney General, if the Attorney General goes after you. If it's private action, which is a little bit on the unusual side, California has a provision in law that's called the Private Attorney General's Act, which allows individuals to bring forward claims against different companies or different agencies where a district attorney may not. So with the private action side, private plaintiffs may bring forward action. They've got some damages in there anywhere from 100 to 750 per incident. So yeah, there are opportunities for individuals if they can't get the attention of their local law enforcement. Now, let's talk a little bit about curing. One of the things that a lot of the companies, especially that we're working with the legislators, were putting this together, they wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity, especially if there's an inadvertent mistake made. They wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to fix the situation prior to large fines being levied against them. So in the law, companies that are doing business that have a violation, they have 30 days to cure. And obviously that would be what's considered curing would be between either the Attorney General and the individual company or the individuals with the individual company. But if they're given that 30 days so they can rectify the situation, this makes sure that basically you don't have a lot of gotcha lawsuits that are running around and tearing all these companies in half. But it's a very important component. Just because we're subject to the CCPA doesn't mean we don't have time to remedy the situation. Now, there are some exemptions on disclosing the information or whether or not you have to comply with some of the requests. They're listed here, but essentially they fall into the common sense line. If there are certain federal laws that are in first position for CCPA, then you wouldn't have to either do the disclosure or do the opt-out, opt-in laws. If you need to comply with any type of civil or other types of litigation matters or cooperation with law firms, or if there needs to be some archival information that's retained from a legal standpoint, you kind of get the idea. It's common sense stuff. If there's some sort of overarching legal need that is of a higher need than the privacy aspect, then you kind of jump into some of the exemptions. So there's also some components regarding how young and how old you have to be. So CCPA goes into great depth in making sure that the rights of minors and the rights of individuals are protected. So if you're over 16, you don't need you really don't need to worry about it. You can't get the opt-in consent, or you don't need to give it consent. You just need to have the notice that you can opt out. If you're a minor between the age of 13 and 16, the companies cannot assume that you're giving affirmative opt-in. So what you need to get from them, if they're between 13 and 16, you need to get confirmed degree, receive affirmative opt-in consent. I can't get those words out. You need to receive the permission ahead of time before you can start collecting that data. You can't just assume that they want it done. So from 13 to 16, you've got to get their proactive consent. For minors under 13, you must receive that consent from a parent or guardian. And it also must be in an opt-in situation, not necessarily just an opt-out. It's also very, very firm on the regulations regarding disregarding this information. So if you do not use due diligence to determine the age of the person, the CCPA will determine that the business has actual knowledge of the minor's age. So just because you don't know that somebody is 12, according to CCPA, they will assume that if you're collecting the data of a 12-year-old, you know in advance of it. So as the term goes, ignorance is no defense of the law. So another area that they need to be definitely vigilant on. So on the compliance side, I know I've already stressed this quite a bit during the discussion. Really verify and update your privacy policies, and especially the way you make notice to consumers. I think it's important for everybody to take a look at it, especially with the eye of simplicity and with the eye of making sure that that's just very easy for everybody to understand how this all gets put together. On the data, another area, make sure your data mapping and you understand exactly where that data goes, especially with a company that has many divisions and some of their data may float in and out of different CRMs or databases or data aggregators that you might have. Making sure that you can easily track down where your data goes so that when requests come in, they can opt in or opt out or get the information tracked down as you do. And then, again, if you got the policies and you got the data mapping in place, then that shouldn't be too difficult, but you definitely need to make sure you're going through the process. Make sure you confirm your cybersecurity posture and have risk assessments in place so you can protect PII, because you also have your obligations to make sure that's in place. And then finally, making sure you're doing quite a good job of doing the training. Make sure that individual employees understand the need for compliance with individual privacy. That may go everywhere from people managing the help desk all the way to people who are handling the information. Making sure that people are trained well is really important. I'm sure a lot of you work. I work for a company, and when they want to make sure we're staying on the reservation, they make sure that we get training. And I remember every year we got our annual training at Intel because they want to make sure. So, for instance, the easy one, we're breaking the law. Making sure that we're not exfiltrating data to foreign third parties and stuff like that. So you go through your training, and that way, if you do something in 6 months that is completely afoul of that, Intel or whoever can point to you and say, "Hey, we trained this guy. He checked off the boxes. He knows his responsibilities." That way you have to stay in place. So from that standpoint, training remains one of the top things that you can do as you put this board together. It just helps with compliance. I think we have a third question. All right. In general, what's your company or the companies you do business? What do you think their readiness posture is for CCPA? And by the way, I found out while we were playing with this that apparently a speaker and the host cannot answer the question. So I gave it a shot. Are the answers ready to come up? All right. Well, interesting. I'll tell you why I think the interesting. First off, it just seems pretty evenly distributed. It's not a big huge variance, but I'm actually surprised that there's that larger number that's over 75% of the way towards compliance, which is really good to hear. Part of the challenge with the Attorney General having his 6 months of runway to come up with these regulations, I kind of thought more companies would kind of take a back seat to it. But you've already got talking about 40-some% that are already halfway through compliance. So the numbers are actually better than I thought. So excellent. So and that's kind of a wrap up of it. What I put in here, just a couple links. The actual bill text for the CCPA is in there, and the Attorney General's regulations that came out. And I must have forgotten. I did have a link to some files. The listing of stuff that I had on GDPR versus CCPA. It's like another dozen pages. There's a lot of differences that are in there, but these are little reference points for you to take a look at. As always, especially if you're a company looking to be in compliance, make sure you're talking not only to your IT team but to your legal team to make sure that they're checking off on everything. Kind of to wrap things up, it's going to be important that we get in touch with this, especially. There are so very few companies that just deal with business within one jurisdiction or one state, and you can kind of get the idea. This is going to go nationwide. No matter how you slice it up, it's going to be all over the place. And getting ahead of it and kind of doing the work up front will save a lot of efforts. There's also going to be a lot of cleanup legislation. So it would be nice if I could tell you that this one is taken care of. But my guess is we'll probably have additional legislation that's going to be either through regulation or through legislation, firming up some of the codes that they want to put forward as different things come up. And as I mentioned, I think they haven't even really just started scratching the surface regarding video imaging, individual images of people, how that's handled. So I think they've got a fair amount of work to do. So with that, Michael, most of it, and within the time frame we're looking for. So I'll put it back to you.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate that. Before we get into our content questions, we have another poll question, which has to do with the number of participants tonight who are members of the IEEE Computer Society. The IEEE is a co-sponsor of our event, and they like to know how many of their members are showing up at these presentations. So, Dan, if you could put up the poll for the IEEE membership. If you're currently an IEEE member, just let us know so that we can let the Orange County Computer Society of the IEEE know how many of their members participated tonight. And I have one question that Frank can be thinking about before we get to the ones in the Q&A. This was kind of preloaded in our Slack channel, which is, can you speak to some of the privacy issues related to the COVID-19 contact tracking apps that we're hearing about?
Oh boy.
Concerns about being tracked by their phones or whatever with respect to their whereabouts and their contacts concerning the spread of COVID-19. What can you say?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, and candidly, I'd like to say that I thought that one strongly through, but the answer is I haven't. Even when the Attorney General was coming up with all these regulations and rules that he did over the past 6 months, the vast majority of that stuff was done before COVID really started hitting. I think to play it safe, anybody who touches any of that information, especially like geolocation information, contact info, they should really, not only should they have the IT department in there, but they should have the legal department in there also, to make sure that data is being handled in a way that's going to be compliant with CCPA. The implications for that information being exfiltrated, and I mean, because there's requirements within CCPA, not just to make sure you're handling the data properly, but are you handling the data, and do you have enough of a security posture to where people can have the expectation as their data would be secure enough not to have the right to a security breach exfiltrating their data. So when it comes to COVID, and as far as that goes, I almost would put that in the area that's that's kind of a developing question that's coming up. I don't have the answers to it at all, and I think that I would much rather on that one err on the side of getting the legal teams involved and making sure that they're protecting the data and putting that information forward, because it does have implications. I decide I don't want my information. I decide to opt out, right? Well, I've had a contact with somebody who hasn't opted out, but now, does that person have the right to know what I did? Is it just the government agency that can see it? Is it the healthcare provider that can see it? I don't have the answer. It's going to be, especially with combinations and permutations, it's going to get very messy, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Frank.
How's that for a non-answer?
Going like a true politician.
There you go. I'll be here all day.
So just so we kind of know what we're going to do, we'll be taking questions from the Q&A postings for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll adjourn this webinar and we'll open up a more free-form Zoom meeting where you can share your cameras and videos and continue the discussion for another 20 minutes or to a half an hour. So I'll go through some of the questions here and let Frank take a shot at answering them. The first question has a comment that you made early on, and the question is, what is a nonprofit? Is 601c6. So when you nonprofits,
yeah, a nonprofit would be different than a not-for-profit. Nonprofits are like Goodwill and others. I know more about 401, 501c3s, C4s, and stuff like that. What was the number again?
601c6 was what was posted in the question.
I don't know what a 601c6 is. I haven't heard of that as a nonprofit.
Move on to the next question.
Yeah. But basically, just real quick before if you hit any of those, right now we really need to look at it as for-profit companies hitting any of those three criteria.
Okay. Yeah. From Ashwin, does the business also have to disclose the names of the third parties that they've sold your info to so that you can contact those parties and ask them to delete it?
Yeah, they do have to say the names of the. Are you talking about like third-party companies? Yes.
If you pick a company saying delete me, do they have to let you know who they've already sold your information to?
Yes, they have to disclose that information. So you've got a trail and a tracking. So yeah, they have to disclose that info.
Okay. Next question, also from Ashwin. In Europe, thanks to GDPR, a clear "do not sell my personal information" message appears on the website. However, in California and the rest of the US, there's simply a message that informs you how they're using cookies and what types of cookies they are. There is no option to opt out of those cookies. Do you have to accept to continue using the website? Is this even legal?
Probably going forward, most likely not. By the way, I've hit the same websites also, and they're still using cookies and that kind of stuff to move forward. My guess is they're going to have to go to being a bit more declarative, saying, by pressing this cookie, we will collect data on you. That data may be collected and sent to third parties. So I would look at that from the standpoint of notice. If they're not noticing that, they're going to have to pretty soon.
Very good. Next question. Some websites like job verification services require or ask you your social security number to verify you when you're requesting info about yourself. Does this hit your credit score?
I have no idea. I don't work for Experian or any of those people. My guess is, and I just don't know if it's your credit score at all. I believe that most of the general inquiries regarding with Social Security numbers being put in, what's my credit score? From what I've heard, those don't impact, so you can ask over and over again. But on a job search site, I do not know. I would be very surprised if it did, because right now, especially in the time where, jobs, so many people are looking for jobs and everything like that, that would seem markedly unfair if it did hit your credit score when we're in the middle of a pandemic. So.
Okay, next question. I've noticed some websites with pop-up notices that have only one button, accept, but I can close the pop-up with the close X at the top. Per the regulation, can the company still collect even if I click X and don't explicitly accept?
No, there needs to be, once again, we kind of look back at the legislation. If you don't accept, you need to have that declarative notice of information, we will take your information, we will have that opt-in. If the individual, remember we mentioned at the point of before or at the point of collection, they have to get that information at that point in time. If they don't get that piece of information, that company cannot collect the data. Just because they continue on, if they don't do the accept, they can't do it.
Okay.
It would be a violation.
Question from Ansel, our CGI rep. Has there been any enforcement action yet?
No, that's one of the good parts. The law, from a practical standpoint, has been in effect for 3 weeks. And the reason was when the legislation was first written, yes, it goes into effect January 1st of 2020, but the Attorney General's regulation and enforcement really didn't start until July 1. So there's been nothing I've heard of. My guess is that if anybody was, look at it this way, and I think we talked about it a little bit, especially with the numbers that came up on the poll. A lot of companies, especially larger ones, they're getting ahead of this. The legislation was passed in September of 2018. So they had all of 2018, all of 2019 to prep, and then they've had the last 6 months waiting for the Attorney General's clarifications. So when you put all that stuff together, they've had plenty of time to get ready for this, but I have not heard of any action that have taken place. However, I will tell you, I expect a lot to be happening in the second half of the year, and maybe not like major, not multi-million, but more lawsuits based on clarifications. Stuff like that.
Next question from Paul. How do CCPA and HIPAA work together?
How are they so candidly, I haven't looked that much into HIPAA to see if there's any real nexus where they quote unquote work together. HIPAA gives everybody the right to privacy for their personal medical information. I would imagine that any data, if data were to be collected on a non-HIPAA based site, let's say you're going to buy something at Dick's Sporting Goods or something, I imagine that would be exclusive of that, but I really don't know how they really interact together. There's been, in my reading stuff, I haven't seen any interaction in, but obviously if somebody's collecting, I guess you could say, let's say I donate blood to the American Red Cross. They know my blood type. They have HIPAA-based information. They would need to be in compliance. No, I take it back. They're a nonprofit. But they need to make sure my data wouldn't be exfiltrated. So I'd have to take a look at the situation. I don't know the details of how it would work together.
Next from Steve from Caravaggio. This is more of a statement, I think, than a question. CPRA, also known as CCPA 2.0, is now officially on the November ballot. It's a game changer. Also, employment data is in play, another game changer.
Yeah, so when this, I think it's a statement, but it may go back to a little bit of the background. When this was first envisioned, part of the reason that CCPA was put in place was there was a piece of legislation being written by a lot of the tech companies to codify what transparency and what privacy was in terms of their companies. And so what ended up happening was the legislature kind of jumped in and said, hey, we want to, we'd rather you not do a statewide ballot initiative, let's try to write something in legislation. And CCPA was the result of that. Not all the tech companies agreed with all the provisions that are in CCPA, and that's why you're getting the new act that's coming on in the November ballot. And candidly, I haven't looked at all the details of it. My guess is it's going to be taking down some of the restrictions that are in CCPA. But yeah, it's coming, and given the fact that legislation coming out of Sacramento might not be as definitive as it needs to be, we could see this on several upcoming elections going forward with clarifications.
From Nicole, do you know if this will affect altered images and video clips, meaning deep fakes? People can take videos and images off the internet and alter them.
Yeah. So interesting there. Remember I had mentioned earlier that I thought it was pretty silent in the CCPA itself and any of the other privacy acts. They really don't talk much about images or personal information. I'm sorry, not images. They don't talk a lot about images or video. I personally think that they're going to have to spend a fair amount of time doing that. So first off, number one, is my image, is that even a privacy issue? I mean, I'm on a Zoom call, I go out in public, I walk over to Albertsons and I buy food. Do I have an expectation of a right to privacy just for my own personal image? So that's kind of the first one. And then the question she got into was, well, what if we tweak it and modify it so instead of, you take my face and you tweak it and look like my brother? There has been no discussion that I've seen on any of that in any of my readings, but I think it's an important point that they're going to have to get into, because now we get into not only the privacy aspect. I don't even want to talk about copyright. Does Tom Hanks have a copyright to his face and stuff like that? There's going to need to be some real cleanup discussions, and it kind of gets down to the point I made earlier. How difficult is it going to be for a non-technical legislature to write the technical legislation that's going to be required to handle that? So nothing that I've seen yet, but I think it's going to be coming. I think it's a forward-thinking question.
Nicole has a follow-on, which is, can she get your email to contact you outside the ACM meeting? So
certainly, yeah, LinkedIn, so you can find me there too.
Yeah, contact Frank on LinkedIn. I was able to find him there. Next question. If I use a VPN to make it appear I'm surfing from outside California, can I still contact companies to opt out and delete my information?
Okay, read that one more time. So,
if I use a VPN to make it appear that I'm surfing from outside California, can I still contact a company to opt out and delete my information?
Yeah, the legislation itself specifically refers to California consumers. So I guess the question is, can I fake them to think I live in a different state? I guess that's kind of the question that's going forward. The key nexus is it's a California consumer. It's the California consumer that's covered. However you get to that California consumer, legislation doesn't worry about. It's a California consumer.
Another comment from Steve who says CCPA does not override HIPAA or GLBA.
Yeah. I thought the question was, how do they work together?
That was a question from somebody else, and this is a comment from Steve.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, you can't King's X HIPAA with CPA.
Okay, question from Nilo. Can a company collect data about what you did on their site as long as they don't tie it to you?
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's an interesting question. The legislation does now allow for the anonymous collection of data. So, and I actually didn't go into it too much in depth, but it's an area to take a look into. The anonymous aggregation of data is fine within CCPA, at least according to the readings that I've done. As long as it can't be tied to you as an individual, you should be fine. So let's say, for instance, I'm trying to pick an idea here. I've got a company that does traffic management, and I pull in all the information for all these people and their location services to and from work, and I start doing analysis on their traffic patterns. As long as the data is anonymized, I believe you're going to be fine with that.
Okay. By the way, Frank, we hear you a lot more clearly when you lean in.
Oh, got it. Okay. Got it.
Next from Pete. How does CCPA affect ADA regulations on websites?
So it doesn't affect the ADA regulation on websites. What it does is it specifically calls out that anybody that has an ADA need, all the notices and questions that go into that need to be handled in that way. So if somebody has developmental disability, neurological disability, visual disability, the websites need to, regardless of what current ADA compliance things that they have in place, they need to make sure that the individuals with disabilities can exact their CCPA rights as anybody else would.
Okay. A question from my friend Dale Kicken. Is there any anticipated effort to simplify disclosure statements?
This is a state that has lawyers.
Dale's
So
one.
my guess is that it'll kind of be a little bit of a pendulum. Right now, as I mentioned, when I went onto Aetna's site, I had like 9 pages of disclosure. I think that it's going to go far to that side to start, and then as people come up with standard language and the standard understanding, it may get smaller. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see the disclosures getting smaller. I see them getting larger, especially when we talk about cleanup legislation and new regulations. Because even though the Attorney General wrapped up his 6-month analysis, his 6-month analysis created a document that was 29 pages long. I think that they're going to be adding to that as things go forward. My guess.
All right. Question from David. How does this affect buying potential customer lists and building on the individual profiles on prospects?
Okay. Once again, we get back to kind of the foundational component. You can buy customer lists, but if those customers are in California, you're impacted with the disclosure. So if you're a California-based company and you buy a list of people from Vermont, you're good to go. If you live in Vermont and you buy a list and that list has one person on it from California with any PII, you now have to comply with the statute.
Okay.
Yeah.
David has a follow-on. It's quite lengthy here, but let me get through it. This is what the text says about methods of verification for requests on JUSTIA. It doesn't seem to have procedures established for people who do not have accounts, even though we are past the July 1st deadline. And in quotes, providing a mechanism for a consumer who does not maintain an account with the business to request information through the business's authentication of the consumer's identity within 1 year of passage of this title as needed thereafter.
Okay.
All right. Next says, if you're an attorney, it probably means something to you.
Yeah, exactly. That's the $400 billable rate stuff. So I don't really have an answer for that. But the way that the statute's written, basically, you need to come up with a method of authentication that meets your standards so you can be reasonably sure you're talking to the correct person. That's really what it comes down to.
All right.
And most companies already have these procedures in place anyway. That's how you bill and transact and send them information and stuff like that.
Well, Frank, this brings us to the end of the list of questions that were posted in our Q&A. We will now end this webinar and move to a regular Zoom meeting. I will share my screen that has the information about this. It's also, I just posted it